into a nightmare that began on an ordinary day, a story whispered by the wind through the pines of a forgotten mountain, a terror that has no survivors to tell its tale. The old van groaned in protest as it clawed its way up the mountain. Each turn of the wheels on the pitted gravel-strewn path felt like a gamble against gravity and decay. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of pine, damp earth, and the faint metallic tang of nervous sweat. 4 people were crammed within its rattling frame, each lost in their own version of anticipation. Liam gripped his camera bag on his lap, his knuckles white. He was the anchor, the reluctant leader whose pragmatism was often mistaken for pessimism. His gaze was fixed on the dense, unforgiving forest that pressed in on either side of the makeshift road, a sea of dark green and black that seemed to swallow the light. Every so often, he would lift his vintage camera, its brass lens catching the gloom, and frame a shot of the oppressive canopy, but he never pressed the shutter. The images felt wrong, incomplete. They lacked the subject he had dragged them all here to find. Beside him, Maya was oblivious to his tension, a book of local history, its pages yellowed and soft with age, was open in her hands. She was an architectural historian, and for her, this trip was a pilgrimage. It says here, the Bregovac Sanatorium was experimental, she murmured, her finger tracing a line of faded text. They believed the high-altitude air, the mountain cure, could treat not just tuberculosis, but a host of nervous disorders. It was shuttered in the late 50s after a series of incidents. Incidents, Ben echoed from the driver's seat, a wide, reckless grin splitting his face. That is my favorite word. He wrenched the steering wheel, sending a spray of gravel against the van's undercarriage as he navigated a particularly nasty curve. The vehicle fishtailed for a heart-stopping second before he corrected it, laughing. He was the catalyst, the thrill-seeker who had discovered the sanatorium's existence on some obscure urban exploration forum and had not rested until he had convinced the others to come. For Ben, fear was a spice to be sprinkled liberally over the bland meal of everyday life. In the back, wedged between a cooler and a pile of climbing ropes, Ben's younger sister Chloe squeezed her eyes shut. "Could you try to keep us on the road, Ben? I would prefer not to become an incident myself before we even get there." Chloe was the skeptic, the medic in training, who had been guilt-tripped into coming along as their designated safety officer. She carried a trauma kit the size of a small suitcase and an air of weary resignation. She did not believe in ghosts or curses, but she believed in tetanus, structural collapse, and the terminal stupidity of her older brother. "Relax," Ben said, his eyes on the rearview mirror. "This old girl's got character. She would not let us down." The van gave a shuddering cough, as if in direct response. "The road should end soon," Maya said, looking up from her book. "The archives said the last half-mile or so is impassable by vehicle. It was designed that way to ensure the patient's isolation." "Good," Liam said quietly. "The less accessible, the better. Less chance of vandalism. Cleaner shots." He was lying to himself partly. He was not worried about vandals. He was worried about something else. a feeling that had been growing in the pit of his stomach since they had left the main highway and started their ascent. The silence. The forest was unnervingly quiet. No bird song, no rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. Just the strained whine of the engine and the crunch of gravel. It was a dead quiet, a held breath sort of stillness that felt profoundly unnatural. As Maya predicted, the path dwindled from a road to a suggestion before disappearing entirely into a wall of tangled foliage and fallen trees. Ben brought the van to a halt in a small, lopsided clearing. When he cut the engine, the silence that rushed in was absolute and suffocating. For a moment, no one moved. They sat, suspended in the quiet, the gravity of their isolation pressing down on them. Then Ben broke the spell, throwing his door open with a loud creak. "Well, team, welcome to the middle of nowhere. Population, us." They clambered out, stretching their cramped limbs. The air was thin and cold, carrying a damp, loamy smell that clung to the back of the throat. Above them, the sky was a sheet of flat, indifferent grey. Through a gap in the ancient skeletal pines, they saw it. Bregovac Sanatorium. It did not stand so much as it slumped, a colossal wreck of stone and timber perched on a higher ledge of the mountain. Even from this distance, it was an intimidating sight. A sprawling central building with two long, collapsed wings that reached out like broken arms. Empty windows stared out from its facade like 1,000 vacant eyes. The forest had begun its slow work of reclamation, with ivy crawling up the stone walls and young trees sprouting from the gutters. But the building resisted, a monument of decay that refused to fall. "Wow," Maya breathed, her voice full of academic awe. "It is perfect. It is a tetanus trap," Chloe muttered, hoisting her medical bag onto her shoulder. Liam said nothing. He lifted his camera, the weight of it familiar and comforting in his hands. He zoomed in, the powerful lens bringing the sanatorium's decaying face into sharp focus. He scanned the rows of windows, the crumbling cornices, the dark, gaping maw of the main entrance. His finger hovered over the shutter button. He was looking for the soul of the place, the one image that would capture its essence of sorrow and abandonment. They gathered their gear, flashlights, backpacks, a crowbar Ben insisted on bringing, despite Maya's protests about preservation, and started the trek up the final, overgrown slope. The path was slick with damp moss and decaying leaves that shifted under their feet. The silence of the woods seemed to intensify with every step, broken only by their own labored breathing and the snap of twigs. The main gate was supposed to be welded shut. Maya had been emphatic about it, citing a town ordinance from 1962, meant to deter trespassers. It was a massive, wrought iron affair, rusted into a uniform shade of burnt orange, its intricate scrollwork choked with thorns and ivy. But it was not shut. One of the heavy gates was pushed inward just enough for a person to slip through. A dark vertical slash in the barricade. There were no fresh marks on the gate or the stone posts it was mounted to. No sign of a crowbar or a cutting torch. It looked as if it had been simply opened. "Someone has been here recently," Chloe observed, shining her flashlight on the ground. But there are no tracks. The ground was a soft carpet of pine needles and damp earth. Any footprint should have been obvious. There was nothing. Maybe the wind, Ben suggested, though the air was unnervingly still. Who cares? Saves me some work. He pushed the gate further. It swung inward with a low, mournful groan that echoed in the oppressive silence. He grinned back at them. See? It is welcoming us. Liam felt a fresh wave of unease. He ran his hand over the cold, rusted metal. The gate was immensely heavy. It would have taken more than a gust of wind to move it. He exchanged a look with Maya. He could see the same question in her eyes, but her academic curiosity was already overriding her caution. They stepped through the gate and onto the sanatorium grounds. A circular driveway, its cobblestones almost entirely consumed by weeds and grass, led to a grand, porticoed entrance. A fountain, green with algae and filled with black stagnant water, sat in the center of the drive like a witch's cauldron. The sense of being watched was overwhelming. Liam found himself scanning the hundreds of dark windows, half expecting to see a face looking back. The front doors, massive slabs of oak, were also unlocked. They pushed them open and stepped into the belly of the beast. The air inside was thick and cold, saturated with the smell of wet plaster, rotting paper, and something else, something faintly sweet and medicinal, like old bandages and forgotten chemicals. A thick grey blanket of dust covered everything, coating the marble floors, the long overturned reception desk, the tattered remains of velvet armchairs in what must have been a waiting area. But it was the quality of the light that was most unsettling. The daylight that filtered through the tall, grime-caked windows seemed to lose its strength the moment it passed through the glass, becoming weak and diffuse, unable to penetrate the deep shadows that clung to the corners of the room. "Look at this," Maya whispered, running a gloved finger along a section of ornate molding, pure Art Nouveau. They spared no expense. She moved through the space as if it were a museum, pointing out architectural features, her voice a low counterpoint to the unnerving silence. Ben, meanwhile, was like a kid in a candy store. "Let us check out the kitchens. I bet there are some seriously creepy meat hooks down there." He was already heading for a dark corridor off the main hall, his powerful flashlight beam cutting a swath through the darkness. "Ben, wait," Liam called out, his voice sounding small and thin in the vast space. "Rule 1. We stick together. No one goes off alone." Ben sighed dramatically but stopped, jogging back to the group. "Fine, Dad. Stick together. Where to first, then?" "Let us just do a sweep of the ground floor," Liam said, trying to inject a confidence he did not feel into his voice. "Get a feel for the layout." They moved as a group into the next room, a cavernous dining hall. Long trestle tables lay on their sides like the skeletons of great beasts. Rusted metal chairs were scattered everywhere, some still tucked neatly under tables, others hurled into corners. At the far end of the room, a stage was set against a wall where a mural of a cheerful mountain scene was peeling away in long, leprous strips. The dust in here was even thicker, a velvety carpet that seemed to have been untouched for half a century. Chloe knelt down, shining her light on the floor. "This is weird," she said. "What is?" Liam asked, coming to her side. The dust, it is completely undisturbed. Look. She pointed her light towards the doorway they had just come through. Their own footprints were starkly clear, dark indentations in the pale grey. If someone was here recently enough to open the front gate, where are their tracks? They all fell silent, looking at their own footprints, then at the vast, unbroken sea of dust that stretched out before them. The contradiction was stark and unsettling. The open gate suggested a recent visitor. The pristine dust suggested no one had walked this floor in decades. It was then that they heard it, a sound from the floors above. It was faint, but unmistakable, a rhythmic, dragging scrape, scrape, pause, scrape. It was not the groaning of an old building settling, or the skittering of a rat. It was a deliberate, methodical sound, heavy and slow. It sounded like something being dragged across a wooden floor. Ben's eyes lit up with excitement. Told you this place was not boring. What was that? Maya whispered, her academic composure finally cracking. She moved closer to Liam. It is probably just a loose shutter banging in a draft, Chloe said, but her voice lacked conviction. There was no draft. The air was as still as a tomb. Scrape, pause, scrape. The sound continued its slow, steady rhythm from somewhere in the darkness above. I am going to check it out, Ben announced, already moving towards the grand staircase that dominated one side of the main hall. No, you are not, Liam said, grabbing his arm. His heart was hammering against his ribs. Every instinct was screaming at him to get out, to go back to the van and drive down the mountain and never look back. We are not splitting up, and we are not running towards strange noises in a derelict building. Do not be a coward, Liam. This is what we came for. Ben shot back, yanking his arm free. The incidents. This is it. Before the argument could escalate, the scraping stopped. The sudden return to silence was somehow more terrifying than the noise itself. They all stood frozen, straining their ears, listening to the frantic beating of their own hearts. Liam slowly raised his camera, his hands trembling slightly. He focused on the top of the grand staircase, a place of impenetrable shadow beyond the reach of the dying light. The carved balustrade was thick with cobwebs that looked like funeral shrouds. He squinted, trying to see into the blackness. He pressed the shutter. The flash was blinding, a momentary explosion of white that bleached the decay from the world. For a split second, the top of the stairs was illuminated in stark detail. Then he lowered the camera, his blood turning to ice water in his veins. In the brilliant, artificial light of the flash, for a fraction of a second, he had seen it, a shape, tall and impossibly thin, standing just beyond the landing, half concealed by a doorway. It was not a trick of the light or a shadow. It had been solid, and then it was gone. He looked again with his naked eye, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. There was nothing there but dust and shadow. "Did you guys see that?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "See what?" Chloe asked, her flashlight beam sweeping across the top of the stairs, revealing nothing. "You are just spooking yourself, Liam." He knew what he had seen, or what he thought he had seen. He could not be sure, The image had been burned onto his retina for a split second and then vanished, leaving behind only a terrifying after-image of doubt. He chose not to argue. "Let us just be careful," he said, his voice unsteady. Driven by a morbid curiosity that was now stronger than their fear, they began to ascend the main staircase. The wooden steps groaned under their weight, the sound echoing through the cavernous hall. Each step upwards felt like a descent, a journey deeper into the building's oppressive atmosphere. The air grew colder as they climbed. The second floor was a long, straight corridor with rooms branching off on either side. This had been the children's ward. The feeling here was different from the grand decay of the ground floor. It was a place of concentrated sorrow. The air was heavy with it. The wallpaper, decorated with faded clowns and dancing bears, was peeling off the walls in damp, curling strips. The clowns' smiles were grotesque in the narrow beams of their flashlights, their painted eyes seeming to follow them as they moved. Small, rusted iron cots lined the walls of the dormitory rooms, some with thin, rotted mattresses still on them. Tiny, broken toys were scattered on the floor, a single wooden block here, a doll with a missing eye there. It was a gallery of forgotten childhoods, a museum of misery. According to the records, the mortality rate in this ward was astronomical, Maya said softly, her voice trembling. They sent children here with everything from polio to severe asthma. Most of them never left. In one of the smaller, private rooms, something sat on a metal bedside table, catching the light. It was a porcelain music box, shaped like a carousel. Unlike everything else in the room, which was coated in a thick layer of grime, the music box was strangely clean. Its painted horses were bright, its mirrored surfaces almost free of dust. "Do not touch that," Liam said immediately, his voice sharp. But he was too late. Ben was already reaching for it, his curiosity a reckless, unstoppable force. "What is the harm? It is beautiful." He picked it up. It felt cold and heavy in his hand. With a grin, he flicked open the small brass latch on the front. The sound that emerged was not the tinkling, gentle melody of a lullaby. It was a horrifying cacophony, a series of discordant, jarring notes that seemed to claw at the air. It was the sound of a music box that had gone insane, a shrieking metallic jangle that was utterly devoid of harmony or comfort. It scraped at their nerves, making their teeth ache. Ben slammed it shut with a curse, his face pale. The abrupt silence that followed was deafening, thick with the ghost of that terrible noise. "I told you not to touch it," Liam hissed, his own nerves frayed. While Ben was still shaken, Maya, who had been examining the wall near the door, let out a small gasp. "Liam, look at this." She pointed her flashlight at a patch of wall where the clown wallpaper had peeled away completely, revealing the bare plaster beneath. Scratched deep into the surface, over and over again, were two words. The writing was sharp and frantic, a mess of overlapping letters dug into the wall with desperate force. Some of the scratches looked dark and fresh, as if they had been made only moments ago. Maya, who spoke some Croatian from her university studies, translated the words in a choked whisper. "Ne slušaš." "What does that mean?" Ben asked, his bravado gone. "It means," Maya said, her eyes wide with fear, "do not listen." As the weight of those words settled over them, they heard the sound again. The same sound from before. Scrape, pause, scrape. But it was no longer distant. It was close, terrifyingly close. It was coming from just down the long, dark hallway. They all froze, their flashlight beams converging on the blackness at the far end of the corridor. The scraping stopped. The silence pressed in, a physical weight. And then something emerged from the darkness. It rolled slowly, silently, out of the oppressive black and into the center of the dusty hallway, coming to a perfect, gentle stop directly in the path of their trembling lights. It was a small, red rubber ball. It sat there in the middle of the corridor, a perfect sphere of bright, impossible color in a world of grey decay. It had not been thrown. It had rolled with a smooth, deliberate motion, as if pushed by an unseen hand. It did not move. It just sat there, waiting, while the dust motes danced in the flashlight beams around it. A silent, terrifying invitation into the darkness from which it had come. For a long moment, time seemed to stop. The four of them stood transfixed, a tableau of fear carved out of the gloom. Their world shrunk to the space illuminated by their trembling flashlight beams, and the small, red object at its center. The ball was a punctuation mark at the end of a terrifying sentence they were only just beginning to read. It was an object of pure childish innocence in a place that had strangled all innocence. That was the horror of it. Chloe was the first to find her voice, though it was thin and reedy. "It is the floor," she said, more to herself than to anyone else. "It must be slanted." The ball rolled from a higher point to a lower one. "Physics." "From where?" Liam asked, his voice tight. He kept his own light trained on the darkness from which the ball had emerged. "From a perfectly still, sealed-off hallway." "Did physics also push it out of the shadows, Chloe? Maybe an animal?" she offered weakly, but the explanation died on her lips. They all knew it was a lie. No animal would have made that scraping sound. No animal would have rolled a ball with such theatrical precision. "It is a welcome gift," Ben said. He had been pale and shaken after the music box, but the appearance of the ball seemed to have jolted him back to his default setting of reckless bravado. It was a tangible thing, something he could confront. "The little ghost kids want to play. Ben, do not," Maya warned, her hand gripping Liam's arm so tightly he could feel her knuckles pressing into his bone. Ignoring her, Ben took a step forward, then another. He walked down the corridor, his heavy boots stirring up clouds of ancient dust. He stopped just before the ball, looking down at it. Then he looked up, peering into the inky blackness ahead. "Is that all you got?" he shouted, his voice echoing unnaturally in the confined space. "You will have to do better than that." He drew back his foot and kicked the red ball hard. It became a scarlet blur as it shot back down the hallway, disappearing into the darkness with a series of soft, diminishing thuds. The silence that followed was absolute. It felt different now, violated. Ben had thrown down a gauntlet. They waited, every muscle tensed, for the reply. Nothing happened. The corridor remained dark and still. The silence stretched on, becoming its own form of torture. "See," Ben said, turning back to them with a triumphant smirk, though his eyes were still wide and watchful. "Nothing. Just an old, creepy house making noises. Let us keep going." But he was wrong. It was not nothing. As they stood there, a new sound began. It was not the scraping. It was something far more insidious. It started so faintly they almost missed it. A high, thin thread of sound weaving through the silence. It was humming. A child humming a simple, repetitive tune. It was tuneless and flat, the kind of absent-minded melody a lonely child might hum to themselves in the dark. The sound had no direction. It was everywhere and nowhere at once, seeming to emanate from the very walls around them. It slid into their ears and coiled in their stomachs. It was infinitely more personal than the scraping had been. That had been a noise. This was a presence. "Do not listen," Maya whispered, her face ashen. "The wall, it said. "Do not listen." The humming grew subtly in volume, the simple melody twisting, becoming discordant and strange. It was like listening to a familiar song played on a warped record, the notes bending and souring into something deeply unpleasant. "Okay," Liam said, his voice firm, taking charge. "That is it. We are done here. We are going back to the ground floor. Now." This time, there was no argument. Even Ben seemed to understand that they had crossed a line. He had taunted whatever was in this place, and it was now taunting them back. They turned, a tight, frightened huddle, and began to walk quickly back the way they had come. But the hallway, which had been straight and unambiguous moments before, now felt different. The peeling clown wallpaper seemed to writhe in the periphery of their vision. A door to one of the small rooms, which Liam was certain had been closed, now stood slightly ajar, revealing a slice of perfect, impenetrable blackness within. He felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the geometry of the building were subtly shifting around them. He stopped. "What is wrong?" Chloe asked, her voice trembling. "That door," Liam began, but he did not know how to finish the sentence. That it was wrong. That it should not be open. It sounded insane. He shook his head. "Nothing. Let us just go." As they reached the grand staircase, the humming faded, replaced by something new. Whispers. They were like the rustle of dry leaves, skittering just at the edge of hearing. Sibilant and soft, they seemed to rise from the deep shadows that pooled at the bottom of the stairs and curl around the balustrade. They could not make out any words, but the intent was clear. The whispers were filled with a cold, ancient malice. They were the sound of secrets that had festered in the darkness for decades. Maya gasped and pressed her hands over her ears. "They are talking about the treatments," she whimpered, her eyes darting nervously into the shadows. "The hydrotherapy, the isolation rooms. I can almost understand them." "You cannot understand anything, Maya," Liam said, putting a protective arm around her. "It is just the wind. It is suggestion. Your mind is playing tricks on you. but he could feel it too. A pressure in his ears, the ghost of syllables that slid away the moment he tried to focus on them. The building was speaking, and Maya, with her head full of its history, was the most receptive audience. They practically stumbled down the last few steps, their feet hitting the dusty marble of the main hall. They were back on the ground floor, but the feeling of safety they had hoped to find was absent. The vast hall seemed larger now, the shadows deeper. The weak light from the windows seemed to have faded further, as if the sun itself were being consumed by the building's gloom. "We need to leave," Chloe stated, her voice flat with shock. "Not just the floor, the whole building. Get in the van and go." "We cannot just leave," Ben protested, his bravado resurfacing now that the immediate threat had receded. "We just got here. This is the most incredible find of my life. We cannot run away because of a few creepy noises." "That was not a noise, Ben. That was communication," Liam countered, his temper flaring. "It rolled a ball at us. It hummed at us. What part of get out do not you understand?" The argument grew heated, their raised voices echoing in the dead space, a sacrilegious intrusion into the building's silence. Maya stood apart, pale and withdrawn, while Chloe tried to mediate. "Screaming at each other is not going to help. We need a plan." Tired of the bickering, Chloe turned away, walking a few paces toward the massive, rotting reception desk. Something had caught her eye, a small, tarnished brass bell, the kind a visitor would tap for service. It was half buried in the thick dust. She reached out a finger to touch its cold surface, a tiny, solid piece of the sanatorium's past. She was gone for no more than 10 seconds. When she turned back, the others were gone. The main hall was empty. The space where Liam, Maya, and her brother had been standing was now just a swirl of dust motes in the grey light. Their voices were gone. The silence rushed back in, heavier and more profound than ever before. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her skepticism. "Guys," she called out, her voice a pathetic squeak. It was swallowed by the hall. "Ben, Liam, this is not funny." She spun around, her flashlight beam cutting frantic, useless arcs through the oppressive darkness. The hall was a labyrinth of overturned furniture and monolithic shadows. They could not have just walked away. She would have heard them. She was alone, utterly and completely alone. Her breath hitched in her throat, coming in ragged, terrified gasps. The vast, silent emptiness of the sanatorium seemed to press in on her, to smother her. "Hello," she screamed, the word tearing from her throat. The only answer was the echo of her own fear. Then, 3 flashlight beams stabbed the darkness from a doorway to her left, a corridor she was sure had been empty a moment before. "Chloe, what are you yelling about?" It was Ben's voice. Liam, Maya, and Ben were standing there, looking at her with confusion. Relief washed over her so intensely her knees went weak. She staggered toward them. "Where did you go? I turned around and you were just gone." Liam frowned. "We did not go anywhere, Chloe. We were standing right here. You were the one who just wandered off toward the desk and then started screaming." "No," she said. shaking her head, the fear returning as a cold dread. "No, you were over there." She pointed to the empty space in the middle of the hall. "You were right there. I only turned my back for a second." They looked at each other, then back at her. A new, terrible element had been introduced into their dynamic. Mistrust. In Chloe's mind, they had moved, playing a cruel trick, or being moved by something sinister. In theirs, she had become disoriented, her rational mind finally cracking under the strain. There was no way to prove either reality. The building was no longer just a container for the horror. It was becoming an active participant, isolating them, turning them against each other. "Maybe we should check the administrative offices," Maya suggested, her voice still shaky. She was trying to reimpose order, to find a logical path through the encroaching madness. If there are records, patient files, maybe they can tell us what happened here, what the incidents were. It felt like a sane objective in an insane situation, a way to reclaim some control. Liam agreed, seeing the logic in it. If they were going to be trapped here, they might as well try to understand their prison. The administrative wing was a series of small, cramped offices branching off a narrow corridor. Here, the decay was worse. Water had seeped through the ceilings, and a slick, black mold grew in cancerous blooms across the walls. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and rot. Sagging shelves had dumped their loads of paper onto the floor, creating a pulpy, decomposing mess that squelched under their boots. In the largest office, a row of tall metal filing cabinets stood against one wall, rusted but intact. Hope surged. This was it. The source. The answers. Ben, using his crowbar, pried open the first cabinet drawer. It was filled with a solid block of moldy, petrified paper, useless. The second was the same, but the third drawer, near the bottom, slid open with a surprisingly smooth shriek of metal. The files inside were miraculously preserved, though the paper was yellowed and brittle, and the ink faded to a ghostly brown. They were legible. The dry, sealed environment of the drawer had protected them from the damp that had claimed the rest of the office. They pulled the drawer out and set it on a less rotted section of a desk. Maya, with her historian's delicate touch, began carefully lifting out the folders. Liam documented everything with his camera, the clinical click of the shutter a small, reassuring sound in the oppressive quiet. "Patient transferals," Maya murmured, sorting through the files. "Supply manifests," she continued. "Discharge summaries." Then she stopped. "Wait, look at this one." She held up a folder that was thicker than the others. On the tab, a single name was written in neat, cursive script, Luca Horvat. She opened it. Inside were pages of typed notes, interspersed with handwritten observations from a doctor. "Admitted June 12th, 1956, Maya read aloud. "Patient is a 7-year-old boy, Luca Horvat. Admitted for acute nervous hysteria, chronic nightmares, and delusional episodes." Liam leaned closer, his flashlight beam joining hers on the page. Chloe and Ben gathered around, their earlier conflict forgotten in the face of this tangible mystery. The doctor's initial notes were clinical and detached, describing Luca's refusal to sleep and his fear of the dark. But as the weeks went on, the tone of the entries began to change. The professional detachment frayed, replaced by a growing sense of confusion and then alarm. July 3rd, Maya read, her voice barely a whisper. Luca continues to insist that he hears things in the walls at night, not rats. He says it is whispers. He claims a shenachevchek, a shadow man, drags things down the hall outside his room after the lights are extinguished. Staff have been posted to observe. They report nothing. The scraping, Liam breathed. July 14th. Luca's hysteria is worsening. He has begun scratching at the plaster on his walls, attempting to let the whispers out. He has been restrained for his own safety. He keeps repeating one phrase over and over. Ne sluchash. Do not listen. A collective chill ran through the group. This was it. This was the source. There is more, Maya said, her hand trembling as she turned the page. The final entry was dated July 20th. The handwriting was no longer neat. It was a frantic, barely legible scrawl. Luca is gone. The night nurse checked on him at 3 a.m. He was asleep. At 3:15 a.m, she heard a single, sharp noise from his room and went back. The room was empty. The window is barred. The door was locked from the outside. He did not run away. He is simply gone. He has ceased to be here. It took him. The thing he was listening to. It is real. God help us, it is real and it is in these walls. We have to stop listening. It hears us when we listen. It knows we are here. The note ended there. There were no more pages. They stood in stunned silence, the doctor's terrified words hanging in the dead, mouldy air. They were no longer just exploring a ruin. They were standing in a place where a child had vanished into thin air, a place where a man of science had been driven to terrified, incoherent scribbling. Liam, feeling a desperate need to do something, to impose some kind of order on the moment, raised his camera. He had been taking photos of the files, the desk, the room. He flicked the dial on the back of the camera to review the images. He wanted to make sure the text of the file was clear. He clicked backwards through the last few shots, a close-up of the final entry, a wider shot of the folder, a shot of the open filing cabinet drawer they had pulled the files from. He stopped on that one. His heart seized. The photo was of the deep, empty space in the cabinet where the drawer had been. It was dark, a rectangle of shadow, but nestled deep inside, almost hidden behind a metal divider, was a small, round object. A small, round, red object. His blood ran cold. He looked from the digital screen to the actual physical cabinet. The space was empty, just dark, rusted metal. He shone his flashlight deep inside. Nothing. There was nothing there. But it was there, clear as day, in the photograph on his camera. The little red ball. It had not been pushed. It was simply there, in a place it could not possibly be. His camera was seeing something that their eyes could not. a different layer of reality that existed just beneath the surface of their own. "We have to go," he said, his voice a choked whisper. "We have to leave now." This time, no one argued. The file, the doctor's warning, the impossible image on Liam's camera, it was too much. The mystery was no longer intriguing. It was a direct and active threat. They abandoned the files, leaving the story of Luca Horvat open on the desk, and hurried out of the administrative wing. They moved quickly, their flashlights bouncing, creating a frantic dance of light and shadow down the long corridors. They just wanted out, back to the fresh air, the van, the world of logic and reason. As they reached the main hall, the humming started again. It was louder this time, closer. It was the same tuneless, childlike melody, but it was no longer coming from all around them. It had a source. It was coming from the dining hall. As they listened, a new sound layered itself beneath the humming, a low, wet, guttural growl that vibrated through the floorboards. It was the sound of a predator. The great double doors to the dining hall, which they had left wide open, were now shut. "We go around," Liam said, his voice low and urgent. "We do not go near it. We go straight for the main entrance." But Ben, his face a mask of terror and morbid fascination, was already moving towards the doors. The crowbar was gripped in his hands like a weapon. "I have to see," he whispered. "I just have to see what is making that noise." "Ben, no," Chloe cried out, lunging for him, but he was too fast. He put his shoulder to one of the heavy doors and pushed. It swung open with a deep, groaning complaint. The four of them stood frozen in the doorway, their flashlight beams cutting into the cavernous darkness of the dining hall. The room was not as they had left it. The dozens of overturned tables and scattered chairs were no longer in disarray. They had been moved, every single one. They were now arranged in a single, perfectly straight line, forming a narrow walled pathway. The pathway started at their feet and stretched all the way across the vast room, ending at the foot of the small stage at the far end. It was a deliberate ceremonial aisle, an invitation, and on the stage, in the exact center, illuminated by their four converging beams of light, sat the porcelain music box. As if triggered by the light, its lid snapped open. The horrifying, discordant melody began to play, a jangling, insane shriek of noise that filled the dead space, echoing off the high ceilings. It was a song of welcome. It was a song of damnation. The melody played for them, and them alone, at the end of the impossible path that had been laid out just for them. The discordant melody of the music box was a physical assault. It was a spike of sound driven directly into the brain, each jarring note designed to shred nerves and incite panic. For a few seconds, they were all rooted to the spot in the doorway of the dining hall, caught in the headlights of a nightmare. The path of tables was a dare, the stage was an altar, and the music box was the shrieking, malevolent priest officiating a ceremony of madness. "Close the door," Liam yelled, his voice barely audible over the racket. He grabbed Maya's arm and tried to pull her back, tried to get them to swing the heavy oak door shut and seal away the impossible sight. But Ben was transfixed, his face, illuminated in the intersecting beams of their lights, was a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. His knuckles were white where he gripped the iron crowbar. This was it. the ultimate dare. The building had laid out a path for him, singled him out. In his twisted logic, to refuse was to show weakness, to show fear. "Ben, no!" Chloe screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. "Do not you dare! Get back here!" "It is just a box," Ben said, his voice loud and strained, trying to sound confident. "It is a trick. All of it. Lights and sounds." He took a hesitant step forward, planting his boot between the first two tables. He was on the path. "Ben, I swear to God, if you take one more step, I will drag you out of here myself." Liam shouted, raw fury mixing with his fear. Ben ignored him. He was in his own world now, a bubble of adrenaline and defiance. He took another step, then another, moving down the bizarre aisle with a slow, deliberate gait. He kept his eyes locked on the music box on the stage, as if it were a venomous snake he had to charm. The cacophonous music grew louder, more frantic, the closer he got, as if it was screaming at him in delight or rage. The three of them could only watch from the doorway, helpless. To follow him down that path felt like a death sentence. To leave him felt like a betrayal. So they stood, their lights trained on his back, witnesses to his horrifying pilgrimage. He reached the end of the path and stood before the stage. It was only a few feet high. With a grunt, he used his hands to vault himself up. He landed on the dusty wooden planks with a thud that echoed in the vast room. He was on the altar. He walked slowly toward the music box which sat on a small, overturned crate in the center of the stage. The noise was deafening now, a physical pressure against his eardrums. He could see it clearly, the painted carousel horses bobbing madly, the mirrored surfaces reflecting a distorted, screaming version of his own face. As he leaned closer, he saw the scratching he had not noticed before, just above the wind-up key. 4 letters, crudely carved into the porcelain. L-U-K-A. A flicker of doubt crossed his face. This was Luca's box, the boy who had vanished. He reached out a trembling hand, not to touch the box, but to slam the lid shut, to silence the maddening noise once and for all. "Game over," he muttered, his lips barely moving. The instant the tip of his finger touched the cold porcelain lid, 2 things happened at once. The music stopped, and every single one of their flashlights died. The plunge into darkness was absolute. It was a physical blow, a sudden, total sensory deprivation that stole their breath. One moment the hall was filled with harsh light and unbearable sound. The next, there was only a perfect, suffocating blackness, and a silence so profound it rang in their ears. "Ben," Chloe screamed into the void. Her voice sounded thin, swallowed by the immense dark space. There was no answer. A sound tore through the silence from the direction of the stage. It was not a scrape or a hum. It was a wet, tearing sound. The sound of thick fabric or something tougher being ripped apart. It was followed by a choked, gargling gasp. Ben's gasp. Ben. Chloe shrieked again. A raw, primal cry of terror. They heard a brief, frantic scuffling, a desperate, muffled struggle in the blackness. The the sound of boots kicking against the wooden stage, then a single, heavy, sickening thud, and then silence. A dead, waiting, triumphant silence. The darkness held them for an eternity, 10 seconds, maybe 20. They were frozen in the doorway, too terrified to move, too terrified to breathe. Liam fumbled with his flashlight, banging it against his palm, his heart hammering in his chest. Maya was making a small, whimpering sound beside him. Chloe was just screaming her brother's name over and over into the impenetrable black. Then, as one, their flashlights flickered back on. Not the bright, strong beams from before, but a weak, sickly yellow light, as if their batteries had been almost completely drained. They shone the weak beams into the dining hall. The path of tables was still there. The stage was still there. The porcelain music box sat on its crate, its lid now closed, but the stage was empty. Ben was gone. The only things left were his flashlight, which lay on its side, its own weak beam pointing uselessly at the peeling mural on the back wall, and the heavy iron crowbar which lay beside it. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle. He had just been taken, erased from the scene. Chloe started to run forward, down the path. Ben. Liam reacted instantly, grabbing her and hauling her back. She fought him, kicking and screaming, her nails clawing at his arms. Let me go. He is in there. He needs me. He is gone, Chloe. Liam yelled, wrestling her away from the doorway, back into the main hall. He is gone. He and Maya managed to pull the massive dining hall door shut. The finality of the deep boom as it closed echoed the finality of what they had just witnessed. Ben was gone. The creature in the sanatorium, the shadow man, whatever it was real, and it was a hunter. Chloe collapsed, her body racked with shuddering sobs of grief and terror. Maya slumped against a wall, her face a blank mask of shock. She was whispering, so faintly Liam could barely hear it. Nay, slushy. Nay, slushy. We listened. We watched. Liam felt his own sanity fraying. The floor seemed to tilt beneath his feet. Ben, stupid, reckless, infuriating Ben, his friend, was gone, vanished into thin air in a pitch-black room. He had a duty to get the others out, to be the leader. But every part of him wanted to curl up on the floor and scream. He forced the panic down. Okay, he said, his voice shaking. Okay, we are getting out, right now. He led them, half carrying Chloe, towards the main entrance, the towering oak doors they had walked through so easily just a few hours before. He grabbed one of the huge iron handles and pulled. It did not move. He pulled again, throwing his entire weight into it. The door was solid, immovable. It felt as if it had been welded to its frame. It is stuck. Let me try, Chloe said, her voice hoarse. She wiped the tears from her face and joined him. They pulled together, muscles straining, feet slipping on the dusty marble. Nothing. The door did not so much as shudder. They were sealed in. As that horrifying realization dawned, a new sound began. The scraping. But it was different now. It was faster, more energetic. And it was not coming from one place, it was coming from everywhere at once. A scrape from a corridor to their left, a frantic scratching from the floor above them, a deep, dragging sound from the direction of the kitchens. It was the sound of a hunt. The sounds were convergence, a net being drawn around them. The building was alive, and it was closing in. "We need to hide," Liam said, his mind racing. "We need to find a room. One door. Something we can barricade." "The office," Maya whispered, her eyes wide with fear. The office with the files. It was their only option. It was a small, dead-end room, but it was defensible. "Go," Liam yelled. They ran, a desperate, clumsy flight through the decaying grandeur of the main hall. Their weak flashlight beams danced manically, revealing peeling portraits whose eyes seemed to follow them, corridors that seemed to stretch and twist into impossible lengths. The scraping sounds grew louder, closer. They echoed from just around the next corner, from the room just ahead. It was like the building was herding them, toying with them. Whispers returned, slithering out of the shadows, but this time they were clearer. They heard their names: Lee, May, a sibilant, mocking hiss that promised untold horrors. They scrambled down the corridor to the administrative wing, the smell of mold and decay a strangely welcoming sign. They found the office and piled inside, their breath coming in ragged, painful bursts. "The cabinet," Liam gasped. "Help me with the cabinet." Together, they heaved and shoved the heavy, rusted filing cabinet that they had pulled the drawer from, sliding it across the floor until it was wedged tight against the door. It was not much, but it was something. A barrier. For a moment, they were safe. The scraping sounds from the hallway outside seemed to pause, as if the creature was considering its next move. The three survivors huddled together in the middle of the small, moldy room, their chests heaving, their bodies trembling with adrenaline and terror. The silence that pressed in on them now was menacing, pregnant with threat. Chloe, the medic, the pragmatist, was forced to confront the impossible. Her brother had been taken by a monster. He was dead, or worse. All her training, all her knowledge of the human body and its frailties was useless here. She sank to the floor, wrapping her arms around her knees, and began to rock back and forth, a low, keening sound escaping her lips. Liam watched her, his heart breaking. He felt a surge of guilt so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He was the one who had organized this. He had brought them here. Ben's death was on his hands. Maya, who had been standing silently, her eyes unfocused, suddenly let out a small, sharp gasp. She was staring at the desk where they had left Luca Horvat's file. "It is gone," she whispered. Liam turned his light to the desk. She was right. The file, which they had left open, its terrible final page exposed to the air, was no longer there. He moved his light to the filing cabinet they had not used to barricade the door. The drawer they had taken the files from, the one they had left open, was now shut. A cold, methodical dread, far worse than the frantic panic of the chase, settled over Liam. He walked slowly to the cabinet and pulled on the handle of the drawer. It slid open smoothly. Luca's file was back inside, tucked neatly in its alphabetical place, as if it had never been disturbed. But that was not what had made Maya gasp. At the very front of the drawer, placed ahead of all the old yellowed folders, was another file, a new one. Its manila cardboard was clean, crisp, and unmarked by age or damp. It did not belong. With a hand that shook so badly he could barely control it, Liam reached into the drawer and lifted it out. It was a patient file, just like Luca's, but on the outside there was no single name. There were 4 tabs, neatly aligned along the top edge. He read the first one. The name was typed, clean and precise. Liam Keller. His breath caught in his throat. He looked at the second tab. Maya Vujic. He looked at the third. Chloe Vance. He did not want to look at the last one, but he could not stop himself. His eyes were drawn to it. The 4th tab was different. The name was not typed. It was scrawled in thick, black ink that was still so fresh it looked wet. And beside the name, in the space marked status, one word was written: discharged. The name on the tab was Benjamin Vance. A wave of nausea and vertigo washed over Liam. His flashlight fell from his numb fingers, clattering on the floor. This was not a haunting. This was not a haunting. This was not a monster in a house. It was a system, a hospital that was still running, still admitting, and still processing. They had not come here as explorers. They had come here as patients, and one of them had just been discharged. The sight of the file, so clean and mundane, was more terrifying than any monstrous vision. It was the horror of bureaucracy, of paperwork and process. It reframed their struggle. They were not trespassers fighting a ghost. They were inmates in an asylum that spanned dimensions, their identities captured and catalogued. The sanatorium was not just a place, it was a predator that processed its prey. Liam stared at his own name, typed in stark black letters, Liam Keller. It looked alien, a label affixed to a specimen. He felt a profound sense of violation, as if the building had reached into his mind, plucked out his name, and pinned it to a board. Chloe saw the last tab, her brother's name, and the word, discharged. A choked, guttural sound ripped from her throat, a sound of pure animal agony. She launched herself forward, not at the file, but at the filing cabinet they had used to barricade the door. No, she screamed, her voice shredding. You do not get to do that. You do not get to file him away. She beat her fists against the cold, unyielding metal, her blows landing with sickening, soft thuds. He was my brother. My brother. Liam rushed to her, grabbing her arms, pulling her away before she broke her hands. She struggled against him, a whirlwind of grief and rage. He is not a piece of paper, she sobbed, collapsing against his chest, her fight dissolving into heart-wrenching despair. While Liam held the weeping Chloe, Maya picked up the file. Her hands were steady now, her shock replaced by a chilling, academic focus. She was a historian, and this was the primary source document from hell. She opened it. The pages for Liam, Chloe, and herself were blank, just empty intake forms, awaiting details, awaiting diagnosis. But Ben's page was not blank. Under admitting diagnosis, one word was written: defiance. Under treatment administered, another: auditory immersion therapy. And under final outcome, the same clinical word from the tab: discharged. It was a test, Maya whispered, her voice hollow. The music box, the path, it was a diagnostic tool. Ben defied it. He failed the test. The implication was horrifying. They were being evaluated, judged. Liam looked from the file to Chloe's grief-stricken face. He had to get them out. The thought of their own pages being filled, of their lives and deaths being reduced to few cold words in a folder, was an unbearable thought. The scraping sounds outside had stopped. The building had fallen silent again. It was a watchful, patient silence. It had taken one of them. It could wait for the others. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time had lost its meaning in the mouldy, dark room. They huddled together, the barricaded door their only shield. Chloe's sobs eventually subsided into a shattered, silent exhaustion. Liam tried to keep his mind focused, to fight off the creeping paralysis of despair. Maya sat with the file in her lap, her gaze distant and lost in thought. Then a new sound began in the hallway outside. It was not the scraping or the whispers or the humming. It was a slow, rhythmic squeaking, the sound of a single unoiled wheel turning over and over. Squeak, roll, squeak, roll. It was coming closer, moving down the corridor with a calm, unhurried deliberation. It was the sound of a trolley, a medical cart making its rounds. It stopped directly outside their door. The three of them froze, their blood turning to ice. They could hear the faint, delicate clinking of glass against glass, the soft metallic rattle of surgical instruments. A nurse had arrived. A voice slid from under the door, seeping into the room like a noxious gas. It was a whisper, dry as autumn leaves, ancient and sexless. It was calm, measured, and utterly devoid of emotion. Maya Vujic, the voice whispered, "It is time for your therapy." Maya flinched as if she had been struck. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with terror. "You have been diagnosed with an unhealthy obsession," the whisper continued, its tone maddeningly reasonable, a fixation on the past. "You seek answers in dead things, in dust and decay. This is a sickness, but it can be treated. Do not listen to it, Maya," Liam hissed, scrambling over to her. "It is trying to get to you." The voice ignored him. It was focused entirely on Maya. "You want to know what really happened to the children in the hydrotherapy tubs, do not you? The official records are a lie. I can show you the truth. I can show you where the architect, Alenkos, carved his confessions into the stone of the foundation. He knew what he was building here. He knew what he was feeding." The whisper was insidious, a serpent of sound. It was not just making threats, it was offering temptation. It had identified Maya's deepest desire, the need to know, to understand, and was twisting it into a lure. "You were always afraid of hospitals, were not you, Maya?" The voice cooed, and a new, personal cruelty entered its tone. "Ever since you were 5, when you visited your grandmother at the hospital in Split. You remember the smell, the antiseptic, the quiet suffering, the way the sheets were pulled so tight over the beds. You ran from the room, crying. You are still that little girl. You are still running. Open the door, Maya. It is time to stop running. Maya let out a choked sob. How does it know that? She whimpered, pressing her hands to her ears. How could it possibly know that? It is in your head, Liam said desperately. It is reading you. Do not let it in. He tried to cover her ears, to shout over the sibilant whisper, but it was useless. The voice was inside the room with them, inside their minds. Suddenly Chloe moved. Her grief had been burned away, replaced by a cold, clinical fury. She crawled over to Maya, grabbing her shoulders, forcing Maya to look at her. Maya, she said, look at me, right now. Her voice was sharp, commanding. My name is Chloe Vance. I am a student of emergency medicine. You are experiencing an acute psychological attack. I need you to focus on my voice. The screams echo. The whisper hissed from the door. If you listen closely, you can still hear them. Trapped in the plaster, a chorus of lost children. Maya, what is the brachial artery? Chloe demanded, her voice cutting through the whisper. Where would you apply pressure to stop a severe bleed in the upper arm? Maya stared at her, her eyes unfocused. I do not know. Yes, you do. Think. Anatomy 101. It is on the inside of the elbow. Now, what are the 3 stages of hypothermia? It knows my name, Maya wept. I am asking you a question, Maya. Chloe's voice was a slap, mild, moderate, and severe. Now tell me the signs of a tension pneumothorax. Go. It was a battle of voices. The insidious, supernatural whisper from the door, offering poisoned secrets and dredging up old traumas, and Chloe's sharp, demanding voice, forcing Maya's mind onto the tracks of logic and reason, of medicine and procedure. For a terrifying minute, Maya was caught between them, her body trembling, her eyes darting from Chloe to the door. Then, with a shuddering gasp, she focused on Chloe. Tracheal deviation, she stammered. Jugular vein distension. Decreased breath sounds. Good, Chloe said, her grip on Maya's shoulders not relaxing. Good. Stay with me. Outside, the whispering stopped. A moment of silence. Then, with a final, soft clink of metal on glass, the squeaking wheel of the trolley began again, rolling slowly away down the corridor. Its work for the night finished. They had survived. Barely. Maya was left trembling and pale, but she was lucid. Chloe's quick thinking had pulled her back from the brink. They sat in the aftermath, the air thick with fear and the lingering taint of the entity's voice. It will be back, Liam said, the reality of their situation settling like a shroud. It will come for me. Then for Chloe, it will just keep coming until it breaks us. The architect, Maya said suddenly, her voice raspy. The whisper had inadvertently given her a new focus. Alan Koss. The thing mentioned him. I remember reading about him. He was a recluse, a visionary some called a madman. He wrote a manifesto. The sanatorium as self. He believed the building was a living organism, and the patients were its lifeblood. The records mentioned his unusual construction methods, hidden corridors, observation rooms, a central office in the main tower from which he could oversee his organism. A desperate, fragile hope began to dawn. Hidden corridors, Liam asked. Service passages, Maya clarified. Between the walls, for maintenance, but also for watching. He designed it so the doctors could observe the patients without being seen. He wanted the building itself to be the ultimate panopticon. If we could get into those passages, Liam said, his mind racing, we could move through the building without being seen. We could get out. Or at least get to the tower, Maya added, to his office. If there is a weakness to this place, an off switch, it would be there, in the heart. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble based on the ramblings of a mad architect, but it was better than sitting in this room, waiting for the trolley to return. We need the crowbar, Liam said, a cold knot of dread forming in his stomach. It is back in the dining hall, with Ben's flashlight. The thought of returning to that room, the place where Ben had been taken, was almost paralyzing. But they had no choice. They needed the tool. They needed the light. I will go, he said, before either of them could argue. Barricade the door behind me. Do not open it for any reason until you hear me knock 3 times. Then 3 times again. He helped them push the heavy cabinet aside, just enough for him to slip out. The door boomed shut behind him, the sound of the cabinet being scraped back into place, echoing in the hallway. He was alone. The corridor was darker than before, his own flashlight beams seeming weak and inadequate. Every shadow seemed to writhe. Every sound, the settling of the old building, made him jump. He moved as quickly and quietly as he could, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He reached the main hall. It was a vast, dark ocean he had to cross. At the far end were the doors to the dining hall. They were closed. He felt a primal fear of what lay behind them. Taking a deep breath, he crossed the hall and pushed one of the doors open. The room was silent. The path of tables was gone. The chairs and tables were back in disarray, just as they had first found them, covered in a thick, undisturbed layer of dust. The music box was gone from the stage. Ben's crowbar and flashlight, however, were still there, lying in the center of the stage, exactly where he had fallen. It was a trap. It had to be a trap. He stood in the doorway for a full minute, scanning the room and listening. Nothing. Just the oppressive silence. Steeling himself, he ran. His feet pounded on the floorboards, the sound obscenely loud. He vaulted onto the stage, snatched the light and the heavy iron bar and ran back, not daring to look behind him. He slammed the door shut and leaned against it, gasping for breath, his body drenched in cold sweat. He made it back to the office and gave the signal. The door opened and he slipped inside, shoving the cabinet back into place. He held up the crowbar. It was their only weapon, their only key. "Maya," he said, his voice still shaky, "where would we find an entrance to these passages?" He designed them to be undetectable, she said, but there would have to be access points, probably in closets or storage rooms, places out of sight. The walls in here are plaster. Maybe Liam took the crowbar and began tapping along the walls of the office. Most of it was solid stone, but one wall, the one shared with the adjoining office, gave a different sound, a hollow, resonant thud. Without a word, he reared back and slammed the pointed end of the crowbar into the plaster. It shattered, revealing dark, rotting lathe underneath. He smashed it again and again, tearing a hole in the wall, the noise shockingly violent in the quiet room. Soon, the hole was big enough to crawl through. The flashlight beam revealed not the next office, but a space, a dark, narrow, vertical shaft filled with dust, cobwebs, and thick rust-covered pipes. It was no more than 3 feet wide, a claustrophobic's nightmare. A crude metal ladder was bolted to the far wall, leading up into darkness and down into blackness. The air that wafted out stank of stagnant water and something else. Something foul, like old meat. This was it, the sanatorium's circulatory system, its veins. "We go up," Liam said. "The tower is the highest point." One by one, they squeezed through the hole, leaving the false security of the office behind. They were inside the walls now. Liam went first, Chloe second, Maya last. The space was terrifyingly tight. Their shoulders brushed the walls on either side. As they began their slow, terrifying ascent up the ladder, they could hear the building with an unnerving intimacy. The groaning of its timbers was like the moaning of a dying man, and the whispers were everywhere now, slithering around them in the dark, no longer needing to seep under doors. They were inside with them. They climbed in silence, the only sounds their own ragged breathing and the scraping of their boots on the metal rungs. Liam's flashlight cut a weak circle of light above them, illuminating a century of dust and decay. The walls of the passage were grimy brick, and here and there he could see graffiti scrawled in chalk or paint by long-dead workmen, names, dates, obscene drawings. Then his light caught something else. A larger message, written in what looked like tar, circled again and again as if for emphasis. "Maya," he called down softly. "Can you read this?" Maya climbed up beside him, squinting in the dim light. She sounded out the Croatian words, her own voice trembling as she understood them. "Ona vidi kroz zidove," she translated, her voice breaking on the last word. "She sees through the walls." As the final, chilling syllable left her lips, the whispers around them stopped. The groaning of the building ceased. A total, unnatural silence fell within the passage, and in that silence, a new sound began. It started directly below them, at the bottom of the shaft they were climbing. It was the soft, rhythmic, unmistakable creak of a wheel turning slowly on a rusty axle. Creak. They aimed their flashlights down into the blackness from which they had come. The beams pierced the thick, dusty air, landing on the bottom of the service shaft. A figure was there. It was sitting in a wheelchair, a vintage, wicker-backed thing with large, spoked wheels. The figure itself was a silhouette, a hunched shape swathed in what looked like a dark, tattered dress or nurse's uniform. It was the source of the sound, slowly turning one of the large wheels with a single skeletal hand, propelling itself into the shaft, into the light. As the wheelchair rolled fully into the intersecting beams of their flashlights, the figure slowly lifted its head, and they saw that it had no face, only a smooth, pale, unbroken expanse of skin, like a mannequin's head, where the eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. The world contracted to the single, impossible image below them. The hunched figure, the antique wheelchair, the pale, smooth blankness of the face, a monstrous void where features should have been. It was the ultimate negation of humanity, a being defined only by what it lacked. A scream lodged in Chloe's throat, a dry, rasping thing with no sound. Maya simply stared, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. The thing in the wheelchair tilted its head, a slow, inquisitive gesture that was profoundly, hideously wrong. Panic, primal and absolute, shattered their paralysis. "Climb," Liam roared, his voice cracking. "Go now." He did not need to say it twice. They scrambled up the ladder, a frantic, uncoordinated tangle of limbs. Boots slipped on the iron rungs, fingers fumbled for purchase, their ragged gasps echoing in the narrow shaft. Liam risked a glance down. The faceless thing was moving. It was not climbing the ladder. The wheelchair was ascending, rising smoothly through the air, as if the rungs and rails were no obstacle at all. It floated upwards, the slow, rhythmic creak of its wheel, the steady, unhurried beat of their impending doom. It was gaining on them. "Faster," Liam urged, pushing Chloe from below. "There is a landing. I see a landing." A horizontal passage branched off from the shaft about 20 feet above them. It was a dark, rectangular hole, a possible escape from this terrifying vertical chase. They reached it and tumbled inside, one after the other, scraping their hands and knees on the rough concrete floor. They were off the ladder, in a narrow horizontal tunnel. For a heartbeat, they felt a flash of relief. Then they heard the creaking stop, just below the entrance to their tunnel. It was waiting, listening. Liam put a finger to his lips, his eyes wide in the gloom. He clicked off his flashlight. The others followed his lead. They were plunged into a darkness that was somehow thicker and more oppressive than any they had experienced before. It was the blackness of the grave, the inside of a coffin. They held their breath, straining to hear. The silence was absolute. The creaking was gone. They waited. 1 minute, 2, nothing. "Did it leave?" Chloe whispered, her voice a tiny tremor in the immense dark. Before Liam could answer, a new sound began. The dry, sexless whisper. But it was no longer coming from under a door or down a corridor. It was right next to them. It slid from the plaster of the wall, a mere inch from Chloe's ear. "Benjamin is so cold," it hissed. "He is calling for you, Chloe. He wants to know why you left him alone in the dark. He is afraid." Chloe gasped and recoiled, scrambling away from the wall. The whisper followed her, seeming to move along the plaster. "He says his big sister was supposed to protect him. The medic, the smart one. You let the music play, Chloe. You watched him walk the path. You let them take me. The voice was a perfect imitation of Ben's, not his loud, confident shout, but a small, frightened, pleading version of him she had not heard since he was a child, waking from a nightmare. It was an act of profound, calculated cruelty. "It is not him," Liam whispered fiercely, grabbing her arm, trying to anchor her. "It is a trick, a lie." Then the voice shifted its attention. It came from the wall next to Liam's head, a cold spot against his cheek. "The leader," it whispered, and this time the voice was a venomous imitation of Maya's. "So strong, so decisive. You brought them to this place, to me. Their blood is on your camera lens, photographer. Every picture you take is another tombstone. Chloe will die, Maya will die, and you will be the one who developed the image." Liam flinched, the words striking him like physical blows, targeting his deepest insecurities, his guilt. He felt Maya tremble beside him. He knew the entity was speaking to her as well, whispering its own personalized poisons into her ear. They were trapped in a crawl space with a monster that could flay them alive with their own memories and fears. "We have to move," he said, his voice strained. He forced himself to turn his flashlight back on, the beam cutting a frail path through the suffocating darkness. "We have to keep moving." They crawled forward, away from the voices, deeper into the labyrinth within the walls. The passage twisted and turned, a maze of brick and pipe and suffocating dust. They were completely disoriented, with no idea which way the central tower was, or if they were just crawling in circles. The whispers followed them, a constant, sibilant torment. After a few minutes of desperate crawling, Liam saw a faint light ahead, not a flashlight beam, but a dim grey luminescence filtering through a small square opening in the wall, a ventilation grill, an observation point. "Up here," he breathed. He cautiously approached the vent and peered through the dusty slats. He was looking down into a room, a patient's room, but it was wrong. It was not the decayed, peeling ruin he expected. The room was clean. The iron bed was made with crisp, white sheets. A small wooden nightstand stood beside it, and a single barred window looked out not on a grey, dead sky, but on a bright, sunny afternoon. They were looking into the past. A small boy with dark hair was sitting up in the bed, his knees pulled to his chest. He was thin and pale, his eyes wide with a fear that transcended time. It was Luca. The door to the room opened and a figure entered. It was a woman in a starched, old-fashioned nurse's uniform, her movements stiff and economical. Her back was to the vent, but Liam knew who it was. The figure glided to the bedside. She was holding something in her hand, a long, gleaming syringe filled with a dark, viscous fluid. Luca began to tremble, shaking his head, a silent plea on his face. The nurse paid him no mind. She reached out with her free hand, and as she turned slightly, Liam saw her face in profile. It was a smooth, featureless mask of pale skin. He jerked back from the vent as if burned, a strangled cry catching in his throat. "What is it?" Maya asked, crawling up beside him. "What did you see?" "It is her," he choked out. "The nurse. We are seeing the past. She was real. She worked here." "Nurse Emina," Maya breathed, her face ashen. "I read the name in the staffing logs. The head nurse of the children's ward. The records called her stern, but efficient. They said she had a unique gift for calming the most hysterical patients." Maya stared at the vent with a look of dawning horror. "Her treatments. That is what happened to them. That is what happened to Luca." The vision, the confirmation that their tormentor was not some random spectre, but the spirit of a real, cruel person, broke something in Chloe. The whispers, the imitation of Ben's voice, it was all too much. "I cannot," she sobbed, her voice muffled by the tight space. "I cannot do this. Ben." A sound echoed from a branching passage up ahead. A soft scraping. "Liam," a voice called out. It sounded like him, but it was distant. "I think I found a way out." Liam froze. That was not me, but Chloe, her mind clouded by grief and terror, reacted instinctively. "Liam," she called back, hope and desperation in her voice. She scrambled forward towards the sound before Liam could stop her. "Chloe, wait! It is a trap!" She was too fast. She crawled into the branching tunnel and disappeared around a corner. Liam and Maya hurried after her, their hearts pounding. "Chloe!" They heard her call his name again, further away now. Then silence. They reached the corner and peered down the new passage. It was a dead end. A solid brick wall stood 10 yards away, and Chloe was there, her back to it, her face a mask of pure terror. She was not alone. The soft, rhythmic creaking had started again. From the other end of the narrow passage, the faceless nurse in the wheelchair was rolling towards her. It blocked the only exit. Trapped. There was nowhere for Chloe to run, nowhere to hide. The entity moved slowly, deliberately, savoring the moment. Liam and Maya were stuck at the intersection, unable to get to her without going past the thing. They could only watch in horror. But as the wheelchair drew closer, something in Chloe shifted. The terror on her face was replaced by a blaze of pure, unadulterated rage. Her grief, her fear, it all coalesced into a single point of fiery defiance. This thing had taken her brother. It had tortured her with his memory. It would not take her. "Get away from me," she snarled, her voice low and trembling with fury. The faceless nurse raised a hand. It was holding the same syringe from the vision, long and rusted, a drop of black fluid clinging to its tip. "You want to treat me," Chloe screamed, her voice echoing in the confined space. "You want a diagnosis. Here is one. You are a monster, and I am not your patient." She unslung the heavy trauma kit from her shoulder. With a defiant roar, she hurled it with all her might. The heavy bag flew through the air and struck the entity square in the chest. The impact knocked the wheelchair back, but it did not stop. It kept rolling forward. "The human body has 206 bones," Chloe yelled, her medic training becoming a weapon, an anchor in the storm of unreality. "The heart beats 100,000 times a day. Epinephrine is used to treat anaphylaxis. These are facts. You are not real. You are not here. The nurse was only a few feet away now, the syringe held forward like a dagger. Liam knew he had only seconds. He looked at Maya, then at the crowbar in his hand. "Stay here," he commanded. He did not wait for a reply. He charged out of the connecting tunnel and ran at the entity from the side. It was a blind, desperate attack fueled by adrenaline. He raised the heavy iron crowbar over his head and brought it down with all the force he could muster, aiming for the smooth blank head. The sound of the impact was not the wet crunch of bone he expected. It was a loud, sharp crack, like a porcelain plate shattering on a tile floor. The crowbar connected, the faceless head fractured, deep cracks spreading across the pale surface. The entity reeled, its body spasming violently in the wheelchair. It dropped the syringe, which clattered on the concrete floor. Then it opened its non-existent mouth and screamed. The sound was not human. It was a blast of high-frequency static, a shriek of pure psychic energy that tore through the air and slammed into them. It vibrated in their bones and rattled their teeth. Liam's flashlight exploded in his hand, showering him with glass. The walls of the passage seemed to bend and warp around them, the bricks momentarily flowing like liquid. Through the ringing in his ears, Liam saw the entity's fractured head turn towards him. From the cracks in its porcelain face, a thick black smoke began to pour out, like ink bleeding into water. The thing was wounded. It was enraged. It raised a skeletal hand and pointed a long, bony finger at him. Then, with a final, piercing shriek that made the dust on the floor dance, it reversed its wheelchair and retreated back down the passage, disappearing into the darkness. The ungodly sound faded, leaving only a painful, high-pitched ringing in their ears. Liam staggered, his vision swimming. Maya helped him stay upright. Chloe scrambled over to them, her body trembling uncontrollably. They were alive. They had faced it. They had hurt it. Liam looked down the dark, empty corridor where the nurse had vanished. He knew this was not a victory. All they had done was wound a caged animal. They were still locked inside the cage with it. He looked at the cracked, empty syringe lying on the floor. His friends' terrified faces were illuminated by their two remaining flickering lights. They had survived the confrontation. The true horror he suspected was just beginning. The ringing in their ears slowly faded, replaced by the sound of their own frantic, shuddering breaths. They were huddled in the narrow, dark passage, a tangled knot of limbs and terror. Liam's hand throbbed, a sharp counterpoint to the dull ache of fear that had settled deep in his bones. He looked at the bloody mess of his palm where the flashlight had exploded. Chloe, seeing the wound, was jolted out of her own shock. The medic took over. "Let me see that," she ordered, her voice still trembling but regaining its clinical edge. She tore a strip of fabric from the bottom of her shirt and began to expertly clean and bind the wound with supplies from her pockets. The small, practical act was an anchor in the swirling chaos of unreality. It was a statement. We are still here. We are still alive. We can still be mended. We hurt it. Maya whispered, her eyes fixed on the darkness where the faceless nurse had vanished. It bled. Not blood, but something. We actually hurt it. For the first time since they had entered the sanatorium, the power dynamic had shifted. They were no longer just mice in a maze. They had fought back. They had found the monster's teeth, and they had broken one. "It will be back," Liam said, his voice grim. He flexed his bandaged hand. "And it will be angrier. We cannot stay here. We have to get to the tower." The drive to reach the architect's office was no longer a desperate hope. It was a tactical necessity. They had a singular goal, a direction to move in the madness. Guided by Maya's remarkable spatial memory of the building's blueprints, they pressed on. The passages were different now. The building felt sullen. The whispers had ceased. The scraping was gone. A heavy, brooding silence had fallen. The silence of a wounded predator licking its wounds, its attention focused inward. The very walls around them seemed to groan in agony, the timbers shifting, the bricks audibly grinding against each other. They were moving through the body of a creature in pain, and they were the source of its suffering. After a final, terrifyingly rickety ladder, they found it. A small circular hatch in the ceiling of the passage. Using the crowbar, Liam pried it open. Dust and stale, dry air cascaded down. One by one, they climbed out of the suffocating darkness of the walls and into the relative openness of a room. The architect's office. It was a circular chamber at the very top of the sanatorium's central tower. Unlike the rest of the building, which was ravaged by decay, this room was eerily preserved. A fine layer of dust coated everything, but there was no mold, no water damage. It was a time capsule. A massive curved desk made of dark oak dominated the space, its surface covered in rolled-up blueprints and strange brass instruments. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes on acoustics, structural engineering, and darker subjects such as psychic phenomena, local Croatian folklore, and treatises on the occult. For a moment, they felt a sense of relief. It was a pocket of seeming sanity, but as their flashlight beams swept across the room, they saw the dozens of small, discreet viewing slits carved into the walls at various heights, all angled downwards. Alen Kos had been able to stand in this room and secretly observe almost every major section of his creation. This was not a sanctuary. It was a spider's web, and they were standing at its center. On the desk, lying open as if it had been recently read, was a thick journal bound in cracked, black leather. The pages were filled with a spidery, frantic script. The ink faded from black to a rusty brown. It was in Croatian. "This is it," Maya breathed, approaching the desk as if it were a sacred altar. "This has to be his journal." She leaned over it, her flashlight propped on a stack of books, and began to translate, her voice a low, horrified whisper in the silent room. Liam and Chloe stood guard, watching the hatch, their ears straining for any sound of the nurse's return. "He was not just an architect," Maya began, her voice trembling. "He was a believer. He writes about the mountain, not the rock and soil, but a presence within it. A genius lucky, an ancient, sleeping consciousness. He believed it was hungry." She traced the frantic lines of text with her finger. My God, he did not build this place to heal people. He built it to feed the mountain. He designed the sanatorium as a psychic resonant cavity, a focusing lens. He believed the collective suffering of the patients, their fear and pain and despair, would be amplified by the building's acoustics, by its very design, and channeled down as an offering. The truth was 1,000 times worse than a simple haunting. They were in a purpose-built slaughterhouse for souls. What about the nurse? Liam asked, his throat dry. Maya flipped through several pages, her eyes scanning the text. Emina, she said, the name tasting like poison. He calls her his conductor, his high priestess. She was not just a nurse. She was his partner. The treatments she administered were rituals designed to shatter the patient's minds, to break their spirits, to make them more palatable, more easily consumed. The journal described how Emina had died of a fever within the sanatorium's walls in the winter of 1958. Kos had not mourned. He had rejoiced. He wrote that the entity had absorbed her, assimilated her essence, turning her into the building's eternal guardian, its immune system. The faceless thing they had fought was not a ghost. It was a function of the building itself. The final pages, Maya said, her voice dropping to a near inaudible whisper. He talks about the sarse, the heart. It is not a metaphor. It is a physical device he constructed in a chamber in the foundation, directly beneath this office. He built it from kamen, black stone, lodestone from a unique vein he found in the mountain, and woven silver. He calls it his regulator. It focuses the psychic energy. It is the nexus between the building and the entity. She looked up at them, her face a pale mask of terror and dawning realization. He writes that the connection is symbiotic. If the heart is destroyed, the connection is severed. The building will be cut off from its life source. It will die. A final mad scrawl covered the bottom of the last page. Ona Jegladna, Maya read, her voice cracking. She is hungry. She has taken my final offering. Now she calls for me. The sanatorium is the self. I am the sanatorium. Alen Kos had become the final meal, devoured by his own monstrous creation. As the weight of this revelation settled upon them, a profound and sudden cold fell upon the room. The dust on the floor stirred, not from a draught, but from a palpable vibration that seemed to rise from the floorboards. The building knew they had learned its secret. The heavy oak door to the office, the one that led to a conventional staircase, slammed shut with a deafening boom. Liam rushed to it, pulling on the handle, but it was sealed tight. The whispers started again, not from one spot, but from all around them, a chorus of thousands of tormented voices crying out from within the walls. Thick, black, viscous fluid, like tar, began to ooze from the viewing slits, dripping down the walls in greasy rivulets. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone and decay. From the center of the room, the shadows began to coalesce. They swirled and deepened, pulling together into a single, upright form. The faceless nurse, Emina, materialized before them. But she was different. The cracks on her porcelain face glowed with a sickly internal green light. Her form was larger, less stable, seeming to flicker and distort at the edges. She was no longer in her wheelchair. She stood on two legs, her body lurching, her limbs elongating at unnatural angles. The building was pouring all its power into its guardian. This was its final, desperate defense. The journal, Liam shouted over the cacophony of whispers. Did it say how to get to the heart? A trapdoor, Maya screamed, pointing to a circular pattern on the floor beneath the desk. Under the desk, Amina took a lurching step towards them, her head tilting, the cracks on her face widening as a low, guttural growl emanated from the hollow darkness within. Liam and Chloe threw themselves at the heavy oak desk, heaving it aside with a screech of tortured wood. There, just as the journal described, was an iron ring set into the floorboards. As Amina advanced, her shadow falling over them, they hooked their fingers through the ring and pulled. It was stuck fast with age and rust. The crowbar, Chloe yelled. Liam grabbed it, wedged the tip into the seam, and put his entire weight on it. The wood splintered and groaned. Maya, seeing the entity was almost upon them, grabbed a heavy book from a shelf and hurled it at the nurse. It passed straight through her flickering form and hit the far wall. Amina did not even flinch. With a final, desperate heave, the trapdoor ripped open with a crack of rotten wood, revealing a narrow stone spiral staircase that wound down into absolute blackness. "Go!" Liam yelled. Chloe and Maya scrambled into the opening, practically falling down the first few steps. Liam turned to follow, but a skeletal grey hand shot out and grabbed his ankle. He cried out as an icy cold, a cold that felt like the grave, seeped into his skin. He looked up and saw Amina looming over him, her blank face inches from his, the green light from within pulsing angrily. He swung the crowbar wildly, connecting with her arm. There was another porcelain crack, and the hand released him. He tumbled down the stairs, landing in a heap on top of the others. They pulled the trapdoor shut above them, but the wood offered little comfort. They could hear the entity's enraged, static screech from the other side. They were in a narrow stone shaft, the spiral staircase hugging the wall. Their two remaining flashlights cut feeble paths into the oppressive dark. They scrambled downwards, their footsteps echoing in the tight space. Above them, they heard a splintering crash. She was coming through the door. Heavy, lurching footsteps began to descend behind them. She was no longer bothering with subtlety or terror. This was pure pursuit. The staircase ended abruptly in a large, cold space. They had reached the foundation. It was a natural cavern that had been crudely reshaped with brick and mortar, the bedrock of the mountain itself forming the floor and parts of the walls, and in the center of the cavern, they saw it. The heart. It was a cage-like structure of interwoven silver bands, about the size of a man, built around a massive, rough-hewn pillar of glistening black lodestone. The stone pulsed with a faint, sickly green light, the same light that glowed from within Amina. A low, powerful hum emanated from it, a sound that vibrated deep in their chests. This was the source of everything. The whispers, the visions, the power, the direct line to the ancient, hungry thing in the mountain. A monstrous shadow fell across the entrance to the cavern. Amina stood there, but her form had almost completely shed its human shape. She was a lurching horror of elongated limbs and a distorted torso. her blank face a mask of pure malevolence. She was the building's rage made manifest. "Distract it," Liam yelled, his voice raw. He knew there was only one chance. As the creature shambled towards them, Maya and Chloe did the only thing they could. They screamed and ran in opposite directions, their flashlights creating confusing, dancing targets. The creature, its movements clumsy but powerful, hesitated for a second, its head swiveling between them. That second was all Liam needed. He sprinted, not away, but directly towards the heart. He raised the crowbar, pouring every last ounce of his strength, his fear, his grief for Ben, and his desperate will to live into one single, final blow. He brought the iron bar down on the glowing black stone. The impact was explosive, a deafening bell-like chime, a pure harmonic note of utter agony erupted from the stone. The crowbar was ripped from his hands as a shockwave threw him back. The green light of the heart flared, bathing the cavern in an incandescent, blinding glare. The entire sanatorium screamed. It was a physical, structural scream of tearing metal, shattering stone and splintering wood. The cavern began to shake violently. Dust and chunks of rock rained down from the ceiling. The monstrous form of Emina froze. Her body began to flicker violently, like a bad television signal. The green light in her cracked face sputtered and died. She let out one last high-pitched static shriek of rage and disbelief, and then her form dissolved, crumbling into a shower of fine grey dust that was scattered by the violent trembling of the ground. The humming stopped. The whispers were gone. The presence that had filled every corner of the building was just gone, but the building itself was dying. A massive crack split the cavern ceiling, and tons of rock and earth began to pour in. "This way," Chloe shouted, pointing her flashlight towards a section of the far wall where the shaking had dislodged a mass of old brickwork, revealing the dark, damp earth of the mountainside beyond. They scrambled towards it, climbing over heaps of falling rubble. They clawed their way through the narrow opening, pulling themselves out of the collapsing foundation and into the cold, clean air of the forest. They stumbled a few dozen yards away and collapsed, turning to look back just as the great central tower of the Bregovac Sanatorium, its spine broken, groaned one last time and fell in on itself with a deafening final roar. A colossal cloud of dust and century-old secrets rose into the sky, momentarily blotting out the stars. And then, silence. A true, natural silence. The sound of the wind in the pines. The distant call of an early morning bird. Huddled together on the damp earth, Liam, Maya, and Chloe, bleeding, bruised, and utterly broken, watched the first faint rays of the rising sun strike the Croatian mountainside. They had survived the night. They were free. The sun that broke over the mountain that morning was not a gentle warming light. It was a harsh, interrogating glare that exposed every cut, every bruise, every hollowed-out shadow on their faces. They did not speak as they stumbled down the overgrown path, away from the plume of dust that marked the sanatorium's grave. The sounds of the forest, the bird song and the rustle of leaves that had been so unnervingly absent on their arrival had returned. The mountain could breathe again. However, they could not. Every breath was a ragged, painful effort. They reached the old van, a relic from a different lifetime. Liam found the keys still in his pocket, and his hand trembled so violently that he could not fit the key into the lock. Chloe took them from him, her own hand steady, and opened the door. They collapsed inside, the familiar smell of old upholstery and stale coffee, a bizarre comfort in the wake of unimaginable horror. Chloe drove. She drove without a word, her eyes fixed on the pitted road, navigating the treacherous descent with a grim focus. Liam and Maya sat in the back, not touching, each locked in their own private sphere of shock, staring out at the blur of green, their reflections in the glass like ghosts. They left the mountain behind. They drove until the gas tank was empty, bought more with a credit card that felt like an artifact from a forgotten civilization, and kept driving. They did not stop until the pines of Croatia's interior had given way to the bright, impossibly blue expanse of the Adriatic Sea. They stopped in a small, anonymous coastal town where the air smelled of salt and grilled fish, a world away from the smell of mold and fear. They checked into a cheap motel and slept for 20 hours, a deep, dreamless sleep of pure physical and spiritual exhaustion. They never spoke of it, not in detail. There were no words that could contain the truth of what they had endured. How do you explain a faceless nurse? A building that creates patient files for its victims. A hungry intelligence in the heart of a mountain. To speak of it would be to invite madness, to have the world look upon them with pity and disbelief. So they buried it, a shared, secret tomb in the landscape of their minds. 1 year later, October. Liam lived in a small, bright apartment in Zagreb, on the top floor. He had to be on the top floor. He could not stand the thought of anyone living above him. He had developed a severe, suffocating claustrophobia. He could no longer ride in elevators, and he slept with his bedroom window open, even in the freezing Balkan winters. He was still a photographer, but his subjects had changed. He shot bustling marketplaces, laughing children, and sunsets over the old city. His portfolio was a desperate, almost frantic collection of light and life, a constant effort to prove to himself that the world was not entirely made of shadow. The scar on his right palm, a pale starburst pattern where the flashlight had exploded, was a permanent reminder of the darkness he was running from. He had sold his vintage camera. He could not stand the thought of looking through a lens and seeing something that his own eyes could not. Maya had moved back to the coast, to a small town not far from where they had first stopped. She had quit her doctoral program. The thought of stepping into another old building, of poring over historical documents, filled her with a nausea so profound she would be sick for days. The academic curiosity that had once defined her had been surgically removed, leaving only a deep and abiding fear. She worked as a gardener for a small hotel, her hands in the soil, tending to things that grew in the sun. It was simple, quiet work, but at night she was haunted, not by ghosts, but by knowledge. She knew the truth of what lay buried under the rubble of Bregovac Sanatorium. She knew that monsters were real, and that sometimes they came with blueprints. Chloe remained in Zagreb, a few blocks from Liam. On the surface, she was the one who had held together the best. She had thrown herself back into her medical studies with a relentless, terrifying focus. She was at the top of her class, her professors amazed by her calm under pressure and her encyclopedic knowledge. But it was a fragile calm. It was the focus of a soldier who knew the war was not over. She was driven by an impossible, burning need to save everyone. A penance for the one person she could not save. Her skepticism was a pile of ash. She had seen the impossible, had thrown her medical kit at it, had watched her logic shatter against its porcelain face. She now moved through the world with the quiet, weary certainty of a veteran, knowing that there were wounds no science could ever hope to heal. They met on the anniversary. It was their silent, unspoken tradition. They gathered at Liam's bright, airy apartment. They did not talk about Ben, or the building, or the things they had seen in the dark. They talked about the weather, about Maya's prize-winning roses, about Chloe's upcoming exams. They made small talk, the banal, beautiful chatter of the living. But the real conversation happened in the spaces between the words, in the way Liam instinctively checked that the balcony door was unlocked, in the way Maya flinched when a floorboard creaked in the apartment below, in the way Chloe's eyes would occasionally drift to Liam's scarred hand. They were the only members of a club no one would ever want to join. The sole survivors of a story that could never be told. That evening, as the autumn sun began to set, casting long shadows across the city, Liam picked up his new, simple digital camera. "Let us get a picture," he said, his voice softer than it used to be. Maya and Chloe stood together by the open balcony door, the city lights beginning to twinkle behind them. They even managed small, tired smiles. Liam raised the camera, framed the shot, and pressed the shutter. He looked down at the small screen on the back of the camera to see the result. Maya and Chloe were there, smiling their broken smiles. The city was beautiful behind them, but something was wrong. In the reflection on the dark glass of the balcony door, just behind Chloe's shoulder, there was a distortion. It was not a face or a figure. It was just a patch of the reflection that was unnaturally dark, a smudge of shadow that seemed to absorb the light around it. A wisp of black smoke, captured for a fraction of a second. He blinked, his heart suddenly cold. He looked up from the camera. There was nothing there, just the clear glass and the evening sky. He looked back down at the photo on the screen. The shadow was still there. "Liam?" Maya asked, noticing the look on his face. He forced a smile, his lips feeling numb. "Yeah," he said, his voice a dry whisper. "Perfect shot." He deleted the image immediately. They had escaped the sanatorium. They had killed the nurse and silenced the heart. But the ancient hungry thing in the mountain had been there long before Alenkos laid his first cursed stone, and it would be there long after the last of the rubble turned to dust. They had destroyed its mouth, but they had stood at the back of its throat, and a small unseen part of its shadow had followed them out into the light. They had survived, but the story remained untold, a silent scream trapped behind their eyes, because some nightmares do not end when you wake up. They just learn to hide in the light. The story is now complete.